On the morning of July 23, 2006, a 74-year-old artist named Maurice Agus paced back and forth near an art exhibit in Riverside Park in Chester-le-Street, England. And Maurice was frustrated because this was supposed to be one of the biggest days of his entire 40-year career as an artist. Right now, his exhibit, his masterpiece, should be full of people, but it wasn't. So Maurice's exhibit was called Dreamspace. It was this massive structure about half the size of a soccer field, and inside of it was the sprawling network of small, colorful, interconnected rooms. Dreamspace was designed so that visitors could sort of wander from room to room and be affected by the music and soothing lighting and have kind of an immersive, serene experience. And this was by far the largest physical exhibit that Maurice had ever done. So it had taken a lot of preparation, and naturally there had been some construction hiccups, but it was all going to be worth it because Maurice knew it was about to be seen by a lot of people, since it was located in a really big public park. However, before they could actually open, there was still one more hiccup to deal with. This morning, when Maurice had arrived, he'd realized that part of his exhibit had not been set up correctly. So he and his staff had spent the last few hours rushing around to fix everything and add some finishing touches to the exterior. And Maurice knew they really needed to hurry here because making these changes had already taken up way too much time, and they were already late in opening the exhibit. Maurice could see that there were guests who had already purchased tickets who were lining up at the entrance to get into Dreamspace, and they looked confused and sort of annoyed about why they weren't inside already. And so naturally, Maurice was afraid that if he didn't wrap this up soon and start letting people in, these people would just start leaving, which meant they would not get to see how amazing his masterpiece was, and that would be just devastating. So at this point, Maurice just stepped back and he looked at what he and his staff had done so far in terms of fixes. And he decided that, things were looking good enough. They'd addressed the major issues that he had, and even though Maurice was ultimately a perfectionist and would have liked to do even more additions, just getting Dreamspace open at this point was way more important. So Maurice told his staff to stop what they were doing and go to the entrance and start letting the visitors in. A few hours later, around 3:15 p.m., 68-year-old Elizabeth Collings walked into Riverside Park with her 14-year-old grandson. They lived in the area, and they had just decided to take a walk together in the park. And Elizabeth was glad they had. It was like the perfect summer day. There was a light breeze. It was very sunny and warm. And so with the wind rustling her hair and her grandson happily walking beside her, she felt very at peace. But just then, her grandson stopped and sort of broke her peace by telling her to, "Hey, look at this." And Elizabeth turned and looked, where her grandson was pointing. And she saw on the other side of the park, there was this sprawling, colorful structure with a huge line of people out front and soothing music coming from its open doors. And Elizabeth thought, whatever that is, it looked really intriguing and not like anything she had ever seen before. So she was just excited as her grandson to go check it out. And so she said, "Let's go." Just a few minutes later, and Elizabeth and her grandson had purchased their tickets and actually stepped inside the exhibit. And Elizabeth knew instantly that this had been a great idea. The lights were dim inside, and the colorful walls seemed to almost glow as they went from room to room. And all around them, the dreamy, tranquil music played. And even though it was fairly crowded and pretty hot inside, it still felt quite peaceful. And Elizabeth could feel her entire body just sort of relax. And for the next 10 minutes or so, she and her grandson just wandered around slowly, taking in the atmosphere and the lights and the music. It was really nice. At some point, they made their way into this room which had this beautiful blue hue to it. And there was some light coming in from the room next to them, which was sort of brownish. And when the color of the room they were in and this brownish light combined, it sort of had this effect of making the room feel almost green, and then mixed with the music, it was just this really cool experience. And both Elizabeth and her grandson were just sort of transfixed, sort of taking in this really cool exhibit. But as they were taking this in, all of a sudden, there was this deafening snapping sound. And the moment that snapping sound happened, Elizabeth suddenly felt dizzy and disoriented, and as she stared at all the colors around her, the room seemed to almost tilt, and she found herself stumbling a few steps, like the room was moving and she was losing her balance. And at first she wondered if maybe the lights and the heat were just getting to her, Except then, she couldn't help but have this almost floating sensation, like the room itself was moving away from her. And then she realized her feet were no longer touching the floor. The creator of Dreamspace, Maurice, had been outside with the guests who were in line waiting to get into the exhibit. And so far, the day really had been going great. I mean, he had done all those last-minute changes and fixes to the exhibit, and he had sort of got it done just in time to open it up, and now all these people are here, and there's at least 40-some-odd people in line with more and more joining, and everybody who comes out of the exhibit is, beaming and talking about what an incredible experience it was. I mean, the day had been going great for Maurice. Until he heard that snapping sound. When that loud snap rang out, everybody heard it, and then Maurice, who was looking away from Dreamspace, he began hearing screams behind him. And then before he could say or do anything, he just sort of whipped around and looked, and all he saw were these shapes just falling from the sky and smashing into the ground. And at first, Maurice and everybody else around him didn't even know what they were. Then suddenly Maurice realized those shapes were people. So earlier in the day, when Maurice and his staff were sort of hustling to get all those last-minute fixes done on this exhibit so they could open it to the public, well, Maurice, who knew this was going to be his last big art exhibit, this was like the end of his career, it was supposed to be the exclamation point on a storied career here, he was so worried that if he didn't get the doors open fast enough, that people in line were going to leave and not even show up, and it would be this catastrophic failure, that he ultimately basically stopped his staff from finishing all the renovations, all the fixes he needed to do, in favor of just getting people in the door. And the way he sort of rationalized it was, well, I'm a perfectionist, and I would have liked to have done all the fixes, but I did enough. It's good enough. Let's get this place open. Let's send people in. The problem with that is some of the things that he overlooked in his haste to open up the front doors for the public included vital safety precautions. Some of these missed safety precautions included tying down a series of extra ropes to anchor the exhibit to the ground. The staff had ultimately tied down the front of the structure, but, because Maurice rushed them to get the place open, they didn't anchor the back of the exhibit. And this would turn out to be just a catastrophic oversight. Dreamspace was not a regular permanent art exhibit. It was not made of walls and concrete with a real foundation. It was an inflatable exhibit made of plastic sheeting, sort of like what shower curtains are made of. So even though there was just a light breeze going through the park that day, it was enough to sort of suddenly lift the entire Dreamspace structure out of the ground, because again, there was just a couple of anchors, not a full set of anchors, and so suddenly the wind yanks the space out of the ground. That was the snapping sound. And so basically this big structure turned into like a giant hot air balloon, and everybody inside of it, the dozens of people, including Elizabeth and her grandson, were thrown 30 feet into the air. And they're all trapped inside of this plasticky structure that's contorting in the wind up at 30 feet. And as the wind picked up, the higher up they went, the Dreamspace structure, as it contorted, began ejecting all of the people inside of it out. And so that's why when Maurice looked, he saw all these people falling to the ground. In the end, 27 people were injured and 2 were killed, including Elizabeth Collings. As for Maurice Agus, the creator of Dreamspace, he was convicted of a health and safety violation and given a fine. But despite that being a relatively light punishment relative to what happened, he was so devastated by the destruction that his creation caused that he never made anything like it again. This was the last piece of art he ever did. And in fact, he died just 3 years later in 2009. Our second and final story today is called Early Riser. At 5 a.m. on December 24th, 1885, 30-year-old Samuel Wardell abruptly sat up in his bed in New York City, having just been woken up by the sound of his deafening alarm clock. And just like every other morning, Samuel immediately got up out of his bed and he trudged across the floor of his one-bedroom apartment to the shelf where his alarm clock was, and he reset it. Now, the placing of this alarm clock was very intentional. Samuel was a very, very heavy sleeper, and so by putting the clock all the way over there, it forced him to get out of bed, walk all the way across the room to reset it, and then ideally, he just wouldn't go back to bed. And for the most part, he wouldn't. Now, it can't be overstated just how heavy a sleeper Samuel actually was. In fact, he'd actually taken another step to make sure that he really could not sleep through his alarm. He'd made some additional alterations to the alarm clock that made it way louder. Now, this did seem sort of like overkill to most people who knew about it, but it was hard to argue with the results. Samuel had not been late to work in years, and that was really important because Samuel had a very early morning job that he didn't want to lose. He was a city lamplighter. In 1885, large parts of New York City still relied on gas-burning streetlights when it got dark outside. So the way it worked is there was a night shift lamplighter, not Samuel, this is somebody else, who would go around the city and light those lights at dusk. And then in the early morning hours, the morning lamplighter, Samuel, would go put them out again. And so that's why he had to get up early to go put out the lamps. And even though Samuel really didn't like getting up this early, the reality is he did need the job. And also too, he had sort of grown fond of the job. He had a lot of fun doing it. Over the years, he'd become very friendly with basically everybody on his local route. And so he didn't mind it. You know, getting up was painful, but it was worth it. Samuel actually had become so close with the people on his route that night he was going to be throwing this big Christmas party for all these people. It was like all his friends from his job were going to come over and celebrate with him, and he was really excited about it. But that was not going to be until much later that night. You know, for now, he just needed to reset his alarm clock, get dressed, and go out and put out those lamps. Fast forward to the end of the night, and Samuel now he's done with his work, he's back home, all his friends are over, and he's pouring some ale from this big barrel that his friends had brought over for this party, and he's just having a great time. The single room of his tiny apartment was now packed with about 30 people, and they too were all having just a great time. They didn't care how small it was. This was just like an awesome party. Now, by this point, Samuel and his friends had already spent the last few hours drinking, and so they were quite drunk, but they were having a great time, laughing and eating, and everyone's just having so much fun. And so even though it was definitely getting late, and Samuel did have to work the next day, it just felt like the party was not about to end anytime soon, and Samuel was not quite ready to turn it off yet. He was having too good of a time. And so when one of his friends randomly stood up and sort of drunkenly suggested they have an amateur boxing match, Samuel immediately voiced his approval. Along with everybody else, they cheered. They're like, yeah, let's do it. And so Samuel and the other party guests, they cleared the furniture out from, the single room, to set up the boxing ring. And then Samuel and the others all stood back and cheered while two of their friends began, fighting each other in the middle of the apartment. It was like this totally crazy, booze-fueled just madness happening inside of this place. And Samuel was having the time of his life, not thinking remotely about how absolutely miserable it was going to be waking up in now just a few hours when his alarm went off at 5 a.m. He was just doing his best not to think about it. Enjoy the party, that's it. And so for a while, the madness continued until eventually people did get really tired and began leaving, and before long, it was just Samuel standing in his now totally destroyed apartment from this party. And so at this point, Samuel, he looked at his clock and he saw he had, barely 2 hours before he would have to get up for work. And he's thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be so awful. I'm going to feel so miserable. But it was totally worth it. What a great party. And so very drunkenly, Samuel kind of stumbled his way over to his bed. He just fell right down on top of it and he fell asleep. And sure enough, just about 2 hours later at 5 a.m. sharp, his alarm went off. Hours later, on Christmas afternoon, a local police officer walked up to Samuel Wardell's front door and knocked. The officer was there because Samuel's boss had called the station when Samuel had failed to show up for work that morning. And this was so out of character for Samuel that right away his boss contacted the police and said, please, someone needs to go check on him and make sure he's okay. And so now the officer waited at the door for Samuel. But when no one answered, he tried the door handle. And he found it was locked, but this was a very rickety, tiny home, and the officer could tell it would not take much to basically kick the door in. And so after calling out for Samuel a few more times and knocking, pretty loud and still not getting a response, the officer just stepped back and then kicked the door and blasted it open. And so the officer stepped inside the home and immediately saw Samuel. And when he did, he understood why he had missed work. It would turn out when Samuel went to bed after his big party, he forgot to move his bed back into the position that it normally was in. He had moved the furniture around for that boxing match and just didn't put it back. And so instead, he wound up going to sleep with his bed all the way across the room, under the shelf where he kept his alarm clock. And this was like the worst place for Samuel to fall asleep. Because, he had set his alarm to go off at 5 a.m. the following morning, just like he did every day, but his alarm clock was not a normal alarm clock. Samuel had intentionally altered his alarm clock to be way louder than a standard alarm clock. But the way he had done that was fairly unique. He had run a wire between a normal alarm clock and this shelf that had hinges. Basically, the shelf could, be situated like this, or it could fold down, basically making it flush to the wall. So it could hold stuff or be flush to the wall. And so when his normal wind-up alarm clock would go off in the morning and begin to ring, it would begin to vibrate and would sort of move across the shelf. And connected to it was this wire that ran to the hinges. And at a certain point, when this alarm sort of got far enough, it would pull enough to disable the hinges, and the shelf that was situated like this would suddenly fall. And in order to make this alarm really, really loud, Samuel had put a 10-pound rock on that shelf. So the instant the hinges dropped, that 10-pound rock came crashing down and smashed into the floor, causing a huge noise that consistently woke Samuel up. But on the morning after his big party, because Samuel was sleeping now directly under the shelf because he didn't move his bed back, that 10-pound rock didn't hit the ground. It fell and smashed directly into Samuel's head and broke his skull. After being discovered by that police officer, Samuel was rushed to a local hospital, but later died from his injuries. It was August 2016, and the weather in O'Fallon, Missouri was typical for summer: hot, sunny, and humid. 58-year-old Pamela Hup, who lived in O'Fallon, walked to the front door of her neat little 3-bedroom house on Little Brave Drive, and she opened the door. But before stepping outside, she gripped the leash of the family dog and then looked around very intently outside at the other equally tidy upper-middle-class houses that made up her new neighborhood. Pam and her husband Mark had only moved into the Great Warriors subdivision about 2 months earlier, and Pam was still getting a feel for the community. After scanning the street and not seeing any people or cars that were out of place, Pam relaxed and then told herself to stop being ridiculous. It had been a tough few years, but soon she and Mark would have a new circle of friends and acquaintances, and she'd know all her neighbors by name or at least by sight. After all, while Pam and Mark might be new to this particular neighborhood, the couple, along with their 2 kids, had lived in O'Fallon for the past 15 years, and so knew the area as well or better than most of its residents did. In fact, when Pam drove their late-model SUV around O'Fallon, she didn't have to look too hard to find houses that she and Mark had, over the years, bought, renovated, and sold for a profit. Thinking of Mark, with his talent for building things and his passion for fine cabinetry work, Pam smiled to herself. Neither one of them had wound up achieving the dreams they had had when they had graduated from high school, but they had done pretty well for themselves in the house flipping business. Pam stepped outside and closed the front door of her house behind her. Then, as she walked down the gentle slope of her wide driveway towards Little Brave Drive, her 1-year-old puppy pulled at the leash, eager for Pam to pick up the pace. As Pam leaned back to keep her balance, she had a flashback to her teenage years when she was a cheerleader and a member of her high school's gymnastics team. Back then, she could have walked a dog and done cartwheels, both at the same time. Now, with the help of her beautician, Pam still had the blonde hair, But the 5 foot 6 inch tall, curvy, athletic body that had attracted so many admiring looks when she was a teenager had since filled out to a comfortable and stocky overall roundness. But despite the years and the added weight, anyone who had known Pam back in her school days would probably still recognize her. She still had that same wide smile, square jaw, and slightly broad nose that made her features strong and distinctive. And when she laughed, it was the same loud guffaw that had often sounded through the halls of Riverview Gardens High School back in 1976. But Pam hadn't just been a good athlete, she'd also been a good student who got good grades. And going into her senior year of high school, she had been just as excited as her classmates about heading off to college. Except that a few of the admiring glances she got back in high school came from one of the most popular and good-looking boys at her school. And shortly after he had invited Pam to their senior prom, Pam wound up pregnant with his child. And 3 months later, Pam was married to him. And by the time her friends were packing their bags for college or some other post-high school adventure, Pam was spending her days inside of a small apartment looking after a very demanding baby. The marriage had lasted 6 years, and while it only took Pam 4 months after that divorce to marry another man, her second choice in husbands had been a lot better than her first. The second husband, Mark Hup, was a quiet and very likable guy who was 4 years younger than Pam. He had graduated from the University of Missouri in St. Louis, then was drafted by the Texas Rangers professional baseball organization, who promptly sent him to play on their minor league team. But like Pam's dream of going to college, Mark's dream of eventually getting called up from the minor leagues to the major league club, the Texas Rangers, never happened. So Mark had left baseball and fallen back onto his carpentry skills. And in 1987, the family of 3 added another member when Pam gave birth to their son, Travis. 2 years after that, Pam and Mark had surprised their families by packing up their young family and heading 1,200 miles south to Florida. For Pam, it had been the adventure of a lifetime. She and Mark had settled in Naples, Florida, where they bought and flipped a couple of houses, and they bought and sold some other properties. Pam went back to school and earned a degree in internet technology, and for 10 years, the Hups enjoyed a comfortable life in the southwestern part of the Sunshine State. Now, using her free hand to push her short hair off of her hot neck, Pam couldn't help thinking about how much had changed since those early days. Even though Pam and Mark and the kids had enjoyed their time in Florida, both Mark and Pam missed their home state of Missouri. So when Pam's mother, who still lived in Missouri, started experiencing early signs of Alzheimer's, Mark and Pam felt that they needed to head back home and be closer to her. Alzheimer's is a brain disorder that slowly destroys memory and thinking skills, and eventually it destroys the ability to carry out even simple tasks like eating. So, in 2001, the Hups sold their properties in Florida and moved back to Missouri, where they settled in O'Fallon. Once they were back, Pam had worked on and off for years selling life insurance policies for State Farm Insurance Company, while Mark continued to build up their real estate business. 9 years later, in 2010, Pam had filed for disability payments due to neck, back, and leg pain, but when her application was turned down, she just joined Mark full-time in the house flipping business. Now, their daughter and son both had promising careers of their own, and with the responsibilities of hands-on parenting behind Pam and Mark, Pam was hoping that this latest move to their new home on Little Brave Drive in O'Fallon would be their last. She wanted to settle down there. A sudden bark brought Pam's attention snapping back to her dog. She wondered how she would stop and have casual conversations to get to know her new neighbors if her dog was constantly barking and pulling her like this from one tree or bush to the next. A second later, Pam gave herself a mental shake. She had never had any trouble making friends. And if worry over a rambunctious dog was the worst of her problems, then maybe her life really was finally turning around and getting back to normal. Because for Pam, the last 5 years had not been normal at all. In fact, they'd been among the most difficult years in Pam's life. The difficult period had started back in January of 2010, 9 years after they had left Florida to return home to Missouri. That's when one of Pam's best friends, a woman named Betsy Faria, had been diagnosed with cancer. Pam had met Betsy when both women were working at State Farm Insurance back in 2002 and 2003. Even though Betsy was younger than Pam by 10 years, The two of them had similar outgoing and fun-loving personalities. Betsy even had her own side gig as a DJ, a little business she called Party Starters. As they had gotten to know each other, Betsy had come to rely on Pam as a confidant, telling the older woman all about the ups and downs in Betsy's marriage, which included a couple of lengthy separations from her husband. Once Pam had left State Farm in 2003, the two women naturally had less contact with each other, but they still kept in touch. In 2010, after Betsy was diagnosed with breast cancer, Pam and Betsy began spending more time together, and soon Pam was one of Betsy's core people who stood by her side and rallied behind her and her family during such a difficult time. And then later that same year, when the news came in that Betsy's cancer had gone into remission, Pam could not have been happier. But that happiness turned out to be very short-lived. Less than a year later, tragedy had struck again. Betsy's cancer was back, and this time it had spread into her liver. In late November 2011, doctors told Betsy, the bubbly and fun-loving mother of two daughters, that best-case scenario, she had maybe 3 to 5 years left to live. And that was only if Betsy undertook yet another course of aggressive and debilitating chemotherapy. And then, just a little more than 1 month after that dire prognosis, and only 2 days after Christmas, Betsy's family and friends received the terrible and shocking news. Betsy was dead. However, it was not cancer that killed her. On the night of December 27, 2011, the day Betsy died, police near the Farias' home in Troy, just a half-hour north of O'Fallon, had received a frantic 911 call from Betsy's husband, Russ, who told police that his wife had committed suicide. But when police arrived at the scene and saw Betsy, they knew there was no way she could have killed herself. While Betsy had been lying on her couch that evening at about 7:30 p.m., someone had taken a kitchen knife, walked over to where Betsy was probably sleeping, and just started stabbing her. And not once or twice. Whoever had stabbed Betsy had just kept on stabbing her body over and over and over again, plunging the knife into her back, her chest, her neck, her face, her arms. And then when Betsy had rolled off the couch onto the ground, the killer had grabbed her wrists and begun slashing away at them. By the time the killer was finished, Betsy would be left with 56 significant stab wounds across her body. Betsy's husband, Russ, would tell investigators that he had spent the evening with friends who lived 30 minutes away, and then when he got home around 9 p.m., that was when he saw Betsy on the floor. He told investigators that he simply didn't notice the 50-plus stab wounds all over her body. Instead, he just saw the slash marks on her wrist and assumed she had committed suicide. But investigators were not buying his story. And 8 days later, police arrested Russ for murder. And at the trial that followed, Pam had been called by the state prosecutor to testify against Betsy's husband, providing information about the couple's marital problems in the years leading up to Betsy's death. 2 years later, in December 2013, a jury only had to deliberate for 4.5 hours before convicting Russ of first-degree murder and sentencing him to life in prison without parole, plus an additional 30 years. Now, even 3.5 years later, in the middle of a hot summer day, Pam felt a chill go down her spine. Pam felt like nothing in her life had been more traumatic than Betsy's death and that trial, especially since Betsy had listed Pam as the beneficiary on Betsy's life insurance policy. When Betsy made the change, she'd made Pam promise to take care of her daughters with the money. Pam had objected and did not want to be put in this role, but Betsy had insisted that it would be a disaster if her girls or Russ got that huge payout. And even after Russ's trial, it seemed like the emotional body blows just kept coming for Pam. At the end of 2013, Pam received a call from her mother's senior living community telling her that her mother, whose memory and overall health had been steadily getting worse, had died. Pam knew that people meant well when they told Pam and her other 3 siblings that maybe in this case, death had been a mercy, given the fact that their mother's Alzheimer's had gotten so bad she could hardly recognize her own children. But for Pam, that didn't change the fact that her mom had only been 77 years old, and that Pam herself had been one of her mom's primary caretakers. And even if her mom didn't always know who Pam was, their visits together had become a regular and predictable part of Pam's life. And then, 2 years after her mother's death, Pam was absolutely shocked to find out that Russ Faria's legal team had managed to persuade the courts to consider some new evidence in his murder case. The new evidence included documents that suggested the state's case against Russ had been built on a bungled investigation, and it would turn out this new evidence was enough. In November of 2015, just 9 months earlier, Russ, the man Pam had testified against and had played a big role in putting behind bars, was acquitted of his wife's murder and released from prison. Pam was horrified. With Russ now free, she couldn't help but feel scared all the time. Would Russ try to hurt her now, to get revenge for her testimony against him? After all, Pam had not held back in court. She had given up every single detail she could possibly remember Betsy telling her about how awful and abusive Russ was, and it really had an impact on the jury. And so Pam knew Russ must hate her. But now, as Pam turned the corner back onto her street and saw her beautiful new house in view, she tried to push those memories away. She knew what Russ looked like, she knew what kind of car he drove, and she had already taken her own precautions. She and her husband Mark, the year before, had bought a handgun, and recently she had taught herself how to use it. With one last look up and down her street, Pam hustled up her driveway with her dog, then opened her front door, stepped inside, and then shut and locked the door behind them. A few days later, on the morning of Tuesday, August 16th, Pam got up, she took her dog for a quick walk, and then tidied up her already tidy house. Then Pam took a deep breath and opened up her front door and stepped outside and began immediately scanning the nearby streets and houses. Luckily, she didn't see any strange cars or people or Russ, and so it was all clear. A minute later, Pam had hopped inside of her SUV. She had backed out of the driveway onto Little Brave Drive. She left the Great Warrior subdivision, picked up Route 70, and headed east. After she finished shopping, she planned to run a few other errands and then drop by her daughter's house. Just a few hours later, right around noon, Pam was pulling back into her driveway. It had been an excellent morning, even if it had turned out that Pam's daughter had not been at home. Pam reminded herself that even if her daughter had been there, they wouldn't have been able to visit for very long because Pam needed to get back home and let the dog out again. But as Pam was about to press the remote to open her garage door, she noticed a flash in her rearview mirror. She turned around and she saw a silver four-door sedan had come to a quick stop right in front of her house by the curb, and a man who she didn't recognize, wearing glasses and a black ball cap pulled down low over his face, was climbing out of the passenger seat. Before Pam could even process what was happening, this man had run up the driveway to her car, opened Pam's passenger door, and climbed inside the car with her and shut the door behind him. A second later, as Pam registered the squeal of tires as the silver car shot away from the curb, the strange man who was now in the car with her pulled a knife out and held it against her throat. Pam could feel the adrenaline flooding her body, and for a second, she was too shocked to even move. As she sat there, paralyzed with fear, the attacker began yelling at her to drive her car to the bank and take out the money she had stolen from Russ. Understanding suddenly dawned on Pam. Russ must have hired this man to do this. Russ wanted Betsy's $150,000 insurance money that Pam had been entrusted with. But then, as Pam thought of this, she wondered if her attacker would actually let her go if she turned over this money. And somewhere deep in her brain, Pam knew the answer to that question. No, this man was going to kill her. Suddenly, Pam's survival instincts kicked in, and using all of her strength, Pam struck out with her right hand and hit the attacker on the face, while simultaneously with her left hand, she fumbled to open the car door. Taken completely by surprise, the attacker lost grip on the knife and it tumbled down onto the floor of the car. By the time he retrieved it, he looked up and saw Pam was out of the car, running towards her garage. But as quick as Pam was, her attacker was even faster. Pam managed to get through the back door that led into the garage, but when she turned around to try to shut and lock it, her attacker had already thrown half of his body into the space between the door and the frame, forcing it open. And so Pam eventually stopped trying to shut the door on him and just turned and ran across her garage and opened the door that led into her house. Once she was inside, she made a quick turn to the right and sprinted into the master bedroom. At this point, the attacker had gotten inside of the garage. He went through the same door that went into the house, But as he went right, he ran so fast he overshot the door that led into the master bedroom where Pam was. And that mistake bought Pam just enough time to get all the way to her bedside table in her bedroom, open up her drawer, and pull out the gun she had put in there. And so by the time the attacker had corrected himself, turned around, and come into the master bedroom, Pam was standing there with the gun held out straight, screaming at him while dialing 911 with her other hand. The time was 12:10 p.m. as the dispatcher at the O'Fallon police station picked up that emergency call. The dispatcher could hear the voice of a woman on the other end of the line calling for help and yelling at an intruder to get out of her house. Then there was the sound of a scuffle and a man's voice in the background, and before the dispatcher could get the caller's address, she heard the distinctive and unmistakable sound of 5 gunshots, all fired in rapid succession. By the time police arrived at Pam's residence just minutes later, Pam was standing just inside of her open garage, clutching the collar of her dog, who was cowering and whining at her feet. And inside of her house, the man who had just attempted to kidnap and rob her was dead. By early afternoon, a very shaken and upset Pamela Hup was sitting inside an interrogation room at the O'Fallon police station, giving police her formal statement, describing exactly what happened. And with hands that trembled, Pam pressed her palms together, extending her thumb and forefinger in the shape of a gun, and showed police how, when the man started coming towards her in the bedroom, she had just kept pulling the trigger of her pistol until she had emptied every round into that man's chest. And although Pam could not tell police who the man actually was, she did feel very confident that Russ Faria had to be involved. He likely sent him. She then explained her connection to Russ and why he might want to hurt her or rob her or both. As she recalled the details of the attack, Pam even thought that maybe the driver of that silver car that had dropped the attacker off, that driver might even have been Russ himself. It kind of looked like him, but she couldn't be sure. She only saw him for a second. After giving police all the information she could possibly think of, Pam signed her official statement, and then she was released. Just like Pam, detectives also believed that what happened to her had to be connected to Russ and his recent acquittal. But 7 days after the attack on Pam, investigators had discovered that while the attack on Pam was indeed connected to Russ, it was connected to him in a way that no one was expecting. Based on what the investigators learned, here is a reconstruction of the days leading up to the attack on Pam, as well as what actually went down on that day, August 16th. On August 10th, 2016, 8 months after Russ was released from prison and 6 days before Pam was attacked, 39-year-old Carol Alford was sitting on the front steps of the porch attached to her home in a trailer park just north of St. Louis. The weather that morning was hot and muggy, but Carol didn't seem to notice. She was wearing a long-sleeve lime green hoodie and lounge pants. Her only concession to the heat was that she didn't have on any shoes, and she was letting her dog wander around her little yard while she sat still, rather than the two of them going out for a walk. At around 11 a.m. that morning, Carol was surprised to see a car she didn't recognize pull up alongside her driveway. The driver rolled down the car window and asked if Carol was interested in earning $1,000. The driver introduced themselves as a producer for NBC's TV program Dateline and said that they were looking for people to help them with a reenactment scene that involved staging a robbery, kidnapping, and a 911 call. Carol thought this was a bit odd, but she was intrigued and she wanted the money, so she said, okay. At which point, the driver instructed Carol not to bring her car keys or cell phone. Carol nodded, but narrowed her eyes. Suddenly, this whole thing felt very off. She told the driver she'd be right back, and then she turned around, walked into her house, and into her kitchen. There, she opened a drawer and began rummaging around inside of it until she found what she was looking for, a folding knife. Carol slipped the knife into one sleeve of her hoodie and then walked over to the counter and took out a large kitchen knife from its holder and put that into her front pouch pocket. Then Carol picked up her cell phone, she silenced the ringer, and tucked her phone out of sight in her pants pocket. $1,000 was a lot of money, but there was no way Carol was getting into a car with any stranger unless she felt like she could protect herself. And so Carol, now armed with 2 weapons and her phone, walked back outside and climbed into the car. As the driver pulled back onto the road, they told Carol that they were doing the reenactment at a location that was just behind a nearby strip mall. But after driving for only a few minutes, Carol suddenly felt like she had made a terrible choice, and she needed to get out of that car immediately. So she told the driver that they needed to go back to her house for just a minute because Carol had forgotten to put on her shoes before getting into the car. The driver looked over at Carol's feet, and sure enough, Carol did not have any shoes on, and even though the driver was really annoyed by this, they agreed to go back to Carol's trailer. When they got there, Carol suggested that the driver pull all the way into the driveway, and then as soon as the car was stopped where Carol had suggested, Carol hopped out, and then as she walked towards the door of her trailer, she very deliberately looked up, making sure that the surveillance camera on the corner of her front porch was aimed directly at the front of the driver's car, where it would get a clear picture of the car's driver and the car's license plate. Carol would go inside of her trailer home and then come out a minute later, still barefoot. She approached the driver and said she changed her mind and did not want to do the gig after all. And then Carol looked again, very deliberately, at the security camera that was now peering down directly on both of them. And then Carol turned around and stared at the driver, suspicion written all over Carol's face. As the driver looked at the camera, Carol stepped back and pulled out her cell phone and showed it to the driver and said, "Yeah, I am going to call the police, and yes, that is a security camera and it's watching you." Without a word, the driver rolled up the window, pulled back out onto the narrow road, and drove away. And true to her word, Carol would call the St. Charles County Police. She told the emergency dispatcher that she just had a very strange encounter with someone claiming to be a Dateline producer, and Carol just wanted the police to know about it. 6 days later, on the morning of August 16th, the day Pam was attacked, the driver who had approached Carol decided to try a different neighborhood further to the south. 40 minutes later, the driver rolled up to a complex of plain 2-story brick buildings separated by strips of lawn and central sidewalks. Scanning the scattering of chairs along the various entryways to the apartments, the driver spotted a young man sitting in the shade, legs outstretched in front of him, head tilted back as he looked up at the cloudy sky. In this man's world, $1,000 was a lot of money. He had 2 young children and not much in the way of income or excitement. So when the driver rolled down the window of their car and explained that they were a Dateline producer looking for someone to reenact a robbery, kidnapping, and 911 call in exchange for what seemed like a small fortune, the young man did not hesitate. A minute later, the young man had hopped into the car, and then on the 17-mile drive west to Pam Hup's house on Little Brave Drive, the driver of the car carefully explained exactly what they wanted the young man to do. "When you get there, tell her to give you the money. Make her drive you to the bank and get it for you," the driver told Lewis. "She's gonna try to make a call to 911, and things might get a little physical, but remember, tell her you are there to get the money. That's the most important part." By the time the car reached Pam Hup's house, the driver's actor for the day was excited and ready to play his part in this reenactment. Little did he know, he was walking into a trap. After the young man had barged into Pam's bedroom, he had tried to follow the script and say the lines that the driver had told him to use, but as he did, he looked up and saw Pam was not only on the phone with 911, but was also holding a gun in her other hand, and she was aiming it at his chest. The young man, believing this must just be part of the reenactment, continued to try to say his lines, but at the same time he began backpedaling into the hall. But before he got there, Pam began pulling the trigger. When police found the young man 10 minutes later, he was lying in a pool of blood, his head propped against a doorway. When police checked his pockets, they found a clear plastic bag containing a handwritten note and 9 $100 bills. Although the man was not carrying a wallet, cell phone, or ID, it did not take police long to find out exactly who he was. Running the dead man's fingerprints through their database of known criminals, police got a match to a 33-year-old local St. Charles man named Louis Gumpenberger. According to police records, Louis had had several brushes with the law back when he was in his early 20s, including a drunk driving charge and a few court entries that involved non-payment of child support for his 2 kids. By August 17th, one day after the shooting, investigators were knocking on the door of Margaret Birch, Louis Gumpenberger's mother. She had just gotten back from filing a missing person report for her son at the local police station. Margaret was devastated when police told her that Louis was dead. But when police went on to explain the circumstances of his death, that he had been shot after forcing his way into a woman's house, Margaret dropped a bombshell. What the police had just told her was actually not possible. Meanwhile, investigators from the O'Fallon Police Department were following up on another lead from the St. Charles Police. 7 days earlier, on August 10th, police had received a 911 call from Carol Alford, who described a disturbing encounter she had just had with a stranger who had approached her at her home and then tried to get her to go with them to act out this weird kidnapping robbery scene for $1,000. But at the time, on August 10th, the police did not act on any of the information she gave them. However, fast forward a week back to August 17th, the day after Louis was killed, and suddenly now, given the weirdness of Louis's actions and the statements given by Pam about what she saw and what she heard, it seemed possible that the mystery driver who had been rejected by Carol had simply moved on to someone else to try to wrap up in their bizarre scheme, and that someone else was likely Louis. And so the police hauled Carol into the O'Fallon police station, and they showed her a lineup of 6 photographs of people they thought could be the mystery driver. And without a moment's hesitation, Carol reached over and tapped a particular picture. "This one," she said. "This is the person who approached me." 6 days later, on Tuesday, August 23rd, police had confirmed that yes, the person who approached Carol was the same person who approached Louis. And because they had this mystery person's name and contact information, they decided it was time to go arrest them. It would turn out that when Louis Gumpenberger's mother told police that her son could not have forced his way into Pamela Hup's house, she meant that literally. Louis had been in a terrible car accident in his youth that had left him with a serious and irreversible brain injury. The injury had left him with the mental capacity of a 12-year-old, which made him very gullible and exploitable, and the injury had left him with serious physical limitations as well. Most notably, Louis could barely walk. And so when Louis's mother was told that her son had run up the driveway and barged into Pam's house, Louis's mother knew that could not be true. Louis literally could not run. And it would turn out Louis's mother was correct. Louis did not do any of the things Pam accused him of doing because the story Pam told police about the attack on her had been a total lie. There was never a silver car that suddenly pulled up outside of her house, driven potentially by Russ Faria, that contained Louis, who had then leapt out and charged up the driveway to attack her. What really happened was Pam, aka the mystery driver, had become totally paranoid after Russ was let out of jail. And so, in her crazed, paranoid state, she decided she had to take drastic action to put him behind bars again to protect herself. And so she put together this very elaborate scheme to frame Russ for murder. Then she began looking around town for someone to kill. And she found Carol first, but Carol did not fall for the trap. And so Pam kept looking. And a few days later, she found Louis. And Louis immediately took the bait. Pam led Louis into her house on Little Brave Drive while reminding him that the scene they were about to reenact was just that, it was an act, so just say your lines and everything will be fine. And then, once the pair was in Pam's bedroom, Pam said, "Okay, we're starting the scene now." And at that point, Louis began trying to say his lines, while Pam called 911 and turned away from Louis and fished her gun out of the bedside drawer. The 911 operator would answer Pam's call and immediately hear her scream out that there was an intruder in her house. And then the operator would hear a man in the background, which was just Louis fumbling through his lines. And then the operator would hear Pam fire 5 shots into Louis's chest. After Louis was on the ground, either dead or bleeding to death, Pam pulled a note in a plastic bag from her pocket and she tucked it into Louis's pocket. The note was designed to look like instructions Louis might have been given by Russ. It said, "Get Russ's money, kidnap Pam." Carol Alford would ultimately seal the deal that Pam was indeed the mystery driver and Lewis's murderer. It was Pam's picture that Carol identified in that 6-photo lineup, and Carol provided police her security camera footage taken from outside of her home that clearly showed Pam's license plate on her car and her face as she drove up in her car to Carol's home on the day she tried to lure Carol to her death. And so, at 11 a.m. on August 23rd, police cars rolled into the quiet Great Warriors subdivision in O'Fallon, and just minutes later, they found Pam. She had just left her driveway in her SUV and had made it down the street before police cars surrounded her and forced her to pull over. Moments later, police approached Pam's vehicle and told her that she was under arrest for the first-degree premeditated murder of Louis Gumpenberger. But this was not the end of the story. Far from it. The reason Pam had been so paranoid after Russ got out of jail was not just because she feared retribution from him. It was also because Pam was afraid that the new evidence presented at Russ's second trial would reveal a new suspect in the brutal murder of her friend Betsy Faria. And that new suspect was Pam herself, the beneficiary of Betsy's $150,000 life insurance policy, a policy that Pam had cashed and then given absolutely none of to Betsy's family. And not only had that life insurance policy been officially signed over to Pam 4 days before Betsy was killed, but also Pam, not Russ, had been the last person to see Betsy Faria alive. 5 years earlier, on December 27, 2011, the night Betsy was killed, it was Pam who had driven Betsy home that evening from her chemotherapy appointment. And it was Pam who had helped get Betsy settled comfortably on the family couch, likely just minutes before Betsy was stabbed 56 times with a kitchen knife. And right after that violent and gruesome murder, it was Pam who fed overly willing prosecutors unsubstantiated allegations that Pam claimed Betsy told her in confidence that painted Russ Faria as an abusive and violent spouse. It was also Pam who kept pushing the theory that Russ must have killed his wife in a fit of rage when he discovered he was not the beneficiary of her life insurance policy. And it was also Pam who kept elaborating on that story and bringing in even more damning testimony about Russ to the state's lead prosecutor, and the prosecution team ate it all up. But Russ knew Pam had been lying the whole time, and so immediately after Russ was acquitted and freed from prison, he directed his lawyers and the press to look at all the evidence in his wife's murder case again. And he started urging the courts to investigate Pam as the primary suspect in his wife's murder. And reporters and lawyers weren't just asking questions about Betsy's death. They were also asking questions about the death of Pam's own mother. According to the official police report, on October 31st, 2013, Pam's mother had apparently died of a fall from her second-floor apartment balcony. But in hindsight, that accidental death was starting to look suspicious. The autopsy revealed that at the time of her death, Pam's mother had ingested 8 times her recommended dose of the sedative Ambien. Not only that, the 77-year-old Alzheimer's patient had somehow fallen through, not over, the railings of her balcony. And not only was Pam the last person to see her mother alive, Pam was also one of the beneficiaries of her mother's $500,000 life insurance policy. Just a few hours after Pam was arrested for the murder of Louis Gumpenberger, detectives sat Pam down inside of an interrogation room and reviewed all of the evidence against her. After they were done going over it, Pam's only response was that she wanted to speak to her attorney. When investigators left the room to call her attorney, a video recording of the interrogation session showed Pam reaching across the desk in front of her and grabbing a ballpoint pen that she slips into the back waistband of her jeans. Video footage also showed that while Pam was sitting there alone, she repeatedly reached up and touched each side of her neck as though searching for the location of her jugular vein. If that vein is punctured or severed, a person can quickly bleed to death. When investigators returned to the interrogation room, Pam was waiting for them at the door, telling them that she needed to go to the bathroom. A few minutes later, investigators heard one of their colleagues screaming for medical assistance immediately. After walking calmly into the bathroom, Pam had taken that ballpoint pen she had stolen, and over again, she stabbed herself in both sides of her neck and on the inside of both of her wrists. When officers opened the bathroom door, they found Pam kneeling on the floor in front of the sink, her forehead resting on the tiles. Her shirt was soaked with blood, and more blood spattered the floor and sinks. However, as dramatic as this suicide attempt was, the wounds she inflicted on herself turned out to be non-life-threatening, and so Pam was quickly patched up and sent to jail to await trial. 3 years later, on August 12, 2019, 61-year-old Pamela Hup was sentenced to life in prison without parole for the first-degree murder of Louis Gumpenberger. 2 years later, in 2017, the medical examiner's office changed the official cause of death for Pam's mother from accidental to undetermined. A year after that, in 2018, the state prosecutor and judge who were involved in Russ Faria's first and badly botched trial were both voted out of office. 2 years after that, in March 2020, Russ Faria, now engaged to Carol Alford, the woman Pam had tried to lure to her death, was awarded $2 million in damages for the wrongful conviction that put him behind bars for 3.5 years. And finally, 2 years after that, in February of 2022, Pamela Hup was officially charged with murder in the stabbing death of Betsy Faria. According to the prosecutor who was preparing the case against Pam, the motive for that murder was financial gain. If Pam Hup is convicted of Betsy's murder, the prosecutor has said he will seek the death penalty. In April of 2020, a 17-year-old named Sam, who was an avid outdoorsman, decided to go on a one-night hike in the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. The mountain's name has a bunch of supposed origins, but the one that's generally accepted is people are afraid of the Superstition Mountains because of all the mysterious deaths that have occurred there. And so because people would avoid these mountains in fear of mysterious death, it became the Superstitious Mountains. But Sam was not superstitious and regularly came out here to go hiking, in particular on this 8-mile loop that went through a canyon. And so this one night overnight he planned on doing was going to be on that 8-mile loop where he'd do 4 miles in, camp out, and then 4 miles back. And he planned to do it with a friend, but his friend at the last minute canceled, and so Sam teetered on not even doing it, but ultimately decided, okay, I'll just do it by myself because I'm very familiar with this area. On the day he was supposed to go do this hike, he had planned on getting there early in the day to have maximum lighting, but due to some unforeseen circumstances and traffic and bad road conditions, he didn't get to the trailhead until 5:45 p.m. that night. Sam knew it was a bad idea to start this hike so late because he was going to run out of daylight. He probably was not going to make it 4 miles to the point where he planned on camping out, but he figured with his good health and fitness, he could probably quickly make his way to the 2 or even 3 mile mark, and there were some suitable campsites there. And so he decided he would kind of risk it and just try to go as fast as he could and use the daylight he had to reach a suitable campsite. But he wasn't able to move as fast as he thought he could, and soon the sun was down and it's totally dark, and he's got his flashlight, but that only is able to shine like 10 feet in front of him. And then at one point he nearly falls off of this rock, and he knows had he fallen, he would have gotten really badly hurt, and he's 15 miles away from the nearest help, and he's in a bad cell phone service area, and the roads getting out here are treacherous. No one knows exactly where he is, and it dawns on him that you've made a pretty bad choice, and you should stop right now and make camp here and not try to risk it any further. And so as it happened, where he was, there was this forest right nearby, and he could see there was a clearing about 30 feet off the path when he shined his light. And so he walked into that clearing, and he found it was a great spot to make camp. And in fact, on the edge of this clearing was the remnants of a fire pit. It was very old, but it at least showed someone had camped out right here, and they seemed to have made it just fine. So suddenly he was feeling pretty smart, and he felt pretty good about where he was staying for the night. Now, Sam intentionally did not bring a tent. He liked to sleep on a sleeping pad with a sleeping bag over that, and then he would string up a tarp over the top of him in case it rained. And since this clearing was surrounded by a bunch of pine trees, he was able to string up his tarp over the top, and it was perfect. And pretty soon he had a fire going, and then he cracked open a can of beans, and he began eating his dinner. And as he was eating, he started to get a sense that something was off, something was not right. He began scanning the tree line as if he was going to find something out of the ordinary, but his visibility was incredibly limited because he was sitting right up against a fire. And if you've ever sat next to a fire in a dark forest, your visibility is like 5 feet in a circle around the fire. You really cannot see beyond that. And his vision was also limited by all the pine trees that encircled his clearing. So he really could only see what was immediately around him, nothing else. And he starts thinking, that's gotta be it. Maybe I'm just nervous because I have no visibility. But as he's rationalizing this kind of bad gut feeling, a rock the size of a marble comes soaring into the campsite and lands at his feet. And he looks down at the rock, and immediately he connects that to that sense of dread he had. And he's looking around a little more aggressively now, but again, his vision is very, very limited. And so for the next 15 minutes, Sam is really aggressively scanning the tree line and listening really intently, and he doesn't hear anything, he doesn't see any more rocks get thrown. And so he begins to rationalize and convince himself that there's nothing wrong here. That feeling I have, oh, don't worry about that. He starts telling himself, I must have kicked a rock. That's what it is. Or maybe a rock fell off a tree. But either way, it's something totally explainable and you got nothing to worry about. And after a little while, he convinced himself and he got into his sleeping bag under his tarp and he went to sleep. A couple of hours later, Sam wakes up and he has that same sense of dread, and now it's back with a vengeance. And he can't hear anything, he can't see anything, but he's definitely feeling like something is wrong. And at that moment, as he's listening really intently and looking really carefully, he hears the sound of rustling leaves. It sounds like someone walking through leaves about 30 or 40 meters away from his campsite. And initially, he can't tell if this person or animal is walking towards his campsite or away, but over the next 30 seconds or so, the sounds start to fade, and he convinces himself that, okay, they've left and everything's fine. But just in case, he wanted to grab his flashlight and shine it in that direction, and so he reaches next to him where he had left it when he had gone to bed a couple hours earlier, and he can't find his flashlight. And he's looking around for it, and he can't find it, and he's like, man, that's weird. I had it right here, right next to my body, and it's not here anymore. And that's when the alarm bells start going off in his head, because the only way this flashlight moves is if he moved it. And if it's not here, how did it move? And so he jumps out of his sleeping bag, he ducks out from under the tarp, and he's looking around on the ground in the immediate vicinity of where he was sleeping to find this flashlight. And as he's looking, out of the corner of his eye, he sees some light. And he turns his head, and in the same direction that he had heard those footsteps, those rustling leaves, when he was still laying down, he sees his flashlight laying on the ground about 10 meters away, which means someone or something had been less than a foot away from him to get this flashlight that was right next to him while he was fast asleep and totally helpless, and had moved it all the way over there. And immediately, Sam thinks to himself, that's a trap. They are trying to lure me away from my campsite. Suddenly, he felt so scared he wanted to vomit, but he knew in order to survive this situation, he needed to keep his wits about him. So he puts his boots on and he grabs his knife, and he knows he's not leaving this campsite. In fact, he's going to build the biggest fire he can. He's going to stoke that fire as big as he can get it, and he's not going to go anywhere near that flashlight. For the next several hours, Sam just stood in the middle of his campsite holding his knife, preparing to confront whatever the heck is out in the woods. And over those several hours, he would hear footsteps approach his campsite, turn around, and leave. Every time the fire got lower, he noticed they would come closer and closer and closer, and when he would stoke the fire, they wouldn't come as close. But at about 3 a.m., he ran out of firewood, so unless he went into the woods to get more, he'd be out, and he's certainly not going into the woods. That's the whole point, is to avoid the woods where this thing is. And so as the fire died down, Sam prepared himself mentally for whatever happened next, because he knew that with that fire gone, this thing was comfortable coming all the way in, coming all the way up right next to him to get the flashlight. And so finally, he hears the footsteps approaching, and before this, the closest they had come was maybe about 15 meters away. They were far enough away it didn't feel intimate. It was terrifying, but he had some distance. This time, they walk right up to about 3 meters away, but they intentionally come behind the thickest group of trees, so he can't see them. And it's still dark outside, and he's in that bubble of light near the fire, so he's blind to whatever's on the other side of those trees. But he knows they're there, and they've stopped. And for 2 hours, this poor kid is standing in the middle of this campsite, facing in the direction of whatever is behind the trees. Probably his imagination is going crazy at this point with what could be behind those trees, just waiting for whatever happened next. But ultimately, the only thing that would happen is the sun would eventually come up, and right before it actually popped over the horizon, this thing on the other side finally moved, it turned around and ran away, and it did not come back. And so when the sun finally did come up, Sam didn't just charge out of there because he's still thinking there could be a trap. He waited until it was totally full sunlight, and then he packed up everything he had and he practically sprinted back to the parking lot, back into his car, and he drove nonstop for 20 miles until he got to a gas station where he could park and collect himself. And when he got there, he got out of his car and he went in and he got a drink. And when he came out, he noticed someone had written something on the dust on the back window of his car. And he walks over and it just says, "Sleep well?" ? Sam is confident whoever was stalking him at his campsite is the same person or group of people that wrote this message on his car. And now Sam just wonders, what would have happened if I retrieved that flashlight? In 1982, a very outdoorsy teenage girl and boy who had recently started dating decided to go camping in Maine. Around 1 a.m. on the first night they were there, the girl wakes up because she has to go to the bathroom, and she's about to unzip her tent when she stops because she hears some strange noises coming from outside their tent. It wasn't that loud, but it sounded distinctly like something was digging in the ground. But she really had to go, and she figured, you know what, it's probably just some small animal or something. And so she begins to unzip the tent, and there's a little bit of moonlight that night, and there was a clearing outside of their tent. So the moonlight's pouring through, so she has plenty of illumination. And so she looks through this tiny hole and she can't believe what she sees. It is a grown woman squatting down about 2 or 3 feet away from their tent. Her back is to them, so she can't see that she's looking through the tent. And she's feverishly digging into the ground in front of her. The girl literally falls backwards into her tent. She's so startled by what she sees. And she lands on her boyfriend, who immediately gets up and he's like, "What's going on?" And she goes, "Shh." And she points at the little hole where she had unzipped the tent and she goes, "Look." The boy is confused, but he can tell his girlfriend is very serious, so he sits up quietly and he looks through the little opening in the door and he sees the digging woman. The boy recoils and looks at his girlfriend and he's like, "What is going on out there?" He takes a flashlight and she's telling him, "Don't do it." And he opens up the tent a little bit more and he aims his flashlight directly on this woman. And this gets her attention and she stops digging and she stands up slowly and she turns around and faces them, and she's got no expression. She's not giving them any indication why she's there. She's not acting aggressive. She's not acting scared. She's just completely neutral. And she stands there staring at them for quite a while before turning around and just walking away from their campsite. And after a little while, when they were pretty certain she was gone, they open their tent all the way, they go outside, they kind of scan around with their flashlights and she's nowhere to be found, and they go to where she was digging, and it's just this weird 4-inch deep hole in the ground. There's no rhyme or reason to why she was doing that. And so after sitting there wondering what they should do, they settled on, well, tomorrow we'll tell the park rangers that she was here and maybe they'll do something about it. And so feeling pretty confident that this woman's not going to come back, they both go back into the tent, they zip it shut, they get in their sleeping bags, and they're about to go to sleep when they hear someone running towards their campsite. And they know it's this woman. They immediately unzip the tent and they look out, and now the woman's not digging anymore. She's rummaging through some of their stuff that's outside of their tent. And the way she's doing it, they described as monkey-like. She'd pick something up, look at it, and throw it over her head. She'd pick the next thing up, throw it over her head, back and forth, just throwing things behind her. And so the boy gets out and he shines a light on her and goes, "You need to leave." And she doesn't react. She just keeps flipping through all their stuff until he gets pretty forceful and says, "You need to leave right now." And at that point, she kind of stops and looks at him like, "Huh, what are you doing here?" And then she gets up, turns around, and walks away. Now the couple really doesn't know what to do because she's clearly willing to come back after being confronted. But they stayed outside their tent for about 15 more minutes, shining their light and making lots of noise and treating her like she's an animal. And they're just trying to scare her away from the campsite. And after a little bit of time, they thought, okay, there's no way she comes back now because, we were pretty aggressive with her this time and she seemed to really get it. They both do go back in the tent, and as soon as they zip it shut, they hear her come running straight back to the site, like she was literally waiting in the wings for when they went back in the tent. And this time she runs back to the hole in the ground and she's just feverishly digging into the ground as fast as she can. And this time they come out of their tent and they're mad and they are screaming at this woman to get the F out of here. What are you doing? And this seems to kind of frighten the woman, who gets up and she looks at them like, "Why are you yelling at me?" And she runs away, and it looked almost animalistic the way she was running away, like she was feral. The boy and the girl are totally shaken up at this point. It's about 1:30 in the morning, and this woman just keeps coming back to their site, and they don't know what to do about it. So they turn on some lanterns and they turn on their flashlights, and they decide we're just gonna stay outside until the morning. That way we know she doesn't come back and doesn't steal anything from us. But by about 3:30 in the morning, they've been outside for 2 hours, they're getting cold, they're super tired, the woman's nowhere to be found, and so they finally say, you want to go back in and get some sleep? I think this time she's really gone. They get back in their sleeping bags and they go to sleep. They don't hear her again. The next morning when they get up and they unzip their tent, they look outside and all of their stuff has been thrown all over the campsite. And the hole in the ground that the woman had dug that was previously about 4 or 6 inches deep is now well over a foot deep. And they realize this woman must have been lurking in the shadows in the woods, watching them from 1:30 to 3:30 in the morning. That whole time they were out there kind of warding her off. She was just waiting, just watching them the whole time in the shadows. And as soon as they went into their tent, she must have given it a little bit of time, but then she ran right back over and she ransacked their site. But the strangest thing was, after they looked through all of the stuff she had chucked around, nothing was missing, and there was some pretty expensive stuff that was laying out that she could have taken but didn't. After they picked up their site, they went to the park ranger and they told them about what had happened, but the ranger has no idea what to make of it. He's never heard of such a thing. And so the couple just leaves that day because they're not about to spend another night here. And to this day, they have no idea why this woman was running onto their site and digging into the ground and rummaging through their stuff. It was like she was just a wild animal. In the early 2000s, a teenager named Eben and his father would regularly go hunting in the Georgia backcountry. When Eben turned 14, his father befriended a very wealthy landowner in Georgia who offered them access to one of his best private hunting areas. And just a couple of days later, on October 5th, Eben and his father would take him up on the offer. They woke up super early and they drove out to the edge of this property that was actually fenced in. And they went to a main gate where they had the combo that this guy had given them. They punched in the combo, opened up the gate, drove in, shut the gate, locked it, and then continued down the access road. They followed this road for about 2 miles where it came to a stop right outside of this huge forest. They parked their truck, they got out, they put on their gear, and in the pre-morning darkness began hiking into the woods. Even though they were there primarily to hunt, Eben and his father secretly enjoyed just hiking around the woods and camping out, and any chance they got to extend their hunting trips, they would, even if the hunting wasn't good. And so since they spent a ton of time in the woods together, they noticed almost immediately when they walked into this particular forest that something was off. There's no birds, there's no animals, silence. It's just totally silent. The only sounds they heard that were not them was a single plane that passed overhead. Although they found this very odd, they figured, you know what, this is private property, not a lot of people are out here. I'm sure as soon as we showed up, the animals were aware of us and they've scattered. They finally make it out to the hunting stand that the owner had told them about. They get all settled in, they're getting ready to see some animals. And all day long, they don't see a single animal. They don't hear a single animal. In fact, again, it is just completely silent. Frustrated, they began packing up their stuff, making their way down off the stand, and they started looking for a place to make camp for the night. And Eben's father suggested, well, hey, you know, there's obviously nothing over here. It's been quiet all day. Why don't we walk deeper into the woods a little ways, set up camp there, so tomorrow we have a better chance of seeing some animals. So they hiked for about an hour farther away from where they parked their truck, and they reached this clearing, which is perfect for setting up their camp. And so they set up their tent, and Eben's father says, hey, you know, we still got some daylight. Do you want to go try our luck and see if we can see some animals out here now? Eben's like, yeah, why not? So they hike a little ways away from their campsite, and they set up their blind, and once again, they don't see any animals. It's totally quiet. And so they turn around and they start heading back. As soon as they could see their campsite, which really was just their tent, they noticed that their tent was now collapsed. And Eben's father turns to him and says, oh, it must have been the wind. And Eben says, no, it couldn't have been the wind, because all day today we have been commenting on how quiet it is and how the fact that there's no weather, no wind, no anything is heightening the fact that it's completely silent. So it could not have been wind. So Eben's father is like, well, when you set the tent up, did you not put the posts into the eyelets? Did you not build it correctly? And Eben's like, no, I've made that tent like 1,000 times. I know it was set up correctly. They walk into their campsite and they look down at their tent and they're really confused at what they see. The 2 rods that go in an X over the top of the tent that thread through nylon loops and then anchor at 4 different points on the base of the tent, Well, they had been removed from the four corners. And if you know how a tent works, it works on tension. And once you have a rod anchored in 2 points, it doesn't just pop out. It's anchored at 2 sides. It's actually difficult to remove each anchor. Once one is out, the other comes out easily. But basically, the rod would need to break in order for it to come out of those anchor points, or someone would have to come over and remove it. And they didn't remove them, and none of the rods were broken. Which leaves them with either they failed to set up their tent, even though they had distinct and clear memories of setting it up and double checking it was set up because they put gear inside of it, or someone came over to their campsite while they were gone and undid the 4 corners. They decide, you know what, it can't be some stranger coming over here because we're the only ones with the gate combo. This is private property and no one could have been here. And why would they do that if they came to our campsite? Why would they randomly collapse our tent and then vanish? So it had to be us. We must have not made the tent. And while they didn't really believe that they had not made their tent, they convinced themselves that that's what happened because the alternative was just too bizarre and frankly terrifying to consider. So they build their tent and they make a little fire and they stay up for a little while chatting before being tired and saying, okay, let's just go to bed. They extinguish the fire, they get in the tent, and they both fall asleep. A couple hours later, Eben wakes up suddenly and he's not sure if he's dreaming or not, but he thinks he hears someone laughing a couple hundred meters behind their tent off in the woods. Eben instinctively turns to make sure his dad is still in the tent with him, and he is. And then Eben starts listening really intently to what's happening outside. And all he can hear is silence, like it's been since they got in the woods. He doesn't hear any more laughter, and so he says, okay, I must have just been dreaming, and there wasn't any laughter out there, and eventually Eben goes back to sleep. A little while later, Eben wakes up suddenly again, except this time his dad is already awake and looking around anxiously. And Eben sits up and goes, what's going on? And his dad goes, shh, and he goes, can you hear that? And Eben listens, and to his horror, he hears laughing. He wasn't dreaming before. Eben also realizes the laughter is not coming from the same area he heard it. It's now coming from the opposite direction, and it's a lot closer to them. Eben very quietly and carefully explains to his dad that he actually heard this laughter a couple hours earlier, and Eben's father turns to Eben and says, before we came out here, I asked the owner, should we expect any other hunters or campers or anybody nearby? And the owner said, this is private property and it's fenced in. There is no one there but you guys. After this revelation, they both turn their attention back to just listening because they're hoping this is just gonna stop and whatever this is just gonna leave. But it doesn't leave. They hear footsteps running towards them from way off in the forest. And it's so quiet, it's really easy to hear these footsteps. And whatever this is charging towards them. And then it comes to a complete stop right at the edge of their clearing. At this point, Eben is now grabbing onto his father. Eben's father is holding onto his rifle and he's getting ready to open the tent to confront whatever is out there. And right before he grabs the zipper, this person, whatever it is, starts laughing again. And it's practically right on top of them. It's so loud. They can hear it clear as day right there, right outside their tent. And Eben's father takes a deep breath. He grabs the zipper, and as soon as he begins moving it, the sound the zipper made causes the laughter to stop. They don't hear footsteps, so they know probably something's still out there. But the laughter stops like it's recognized that they're making noise. They're right there. There they are. They're in the tent. Eben's father freezes with his hand on this zipper, and he's debating whether he should go outside or not. And before he can even make that decision, whatever this thing is turns around and runs back into the woods, and it's just gone. And for several minutes, they just sit like that in total silence, praying that whatever this is gone for good. And after several minutes, when they don't hear anything, there's no more laughing, there's no more running, Eben's father re-zips up the tent, puts his hand back down, and they're both left just sitting there thinking, what the heck just happened? Eben and his father would stay up all night, and they would barely speak, because whatever this thing was had heard them when they moved the zipper. And so they were really afraid of making any sound, even little sounds, because it's so quiet, sound travels really far, and they don't know who or what is out there. And so in silence, holding their guns, they're just waiting for the sun to come up. And as soon as it did, they were up and out of there, literally running out of the forest, checking over their shoulder the whole time, all the way back to their truck. And so to this day, they have no idea who or what the heck was running around out there. And they told the owner of the property about it. And the owner just said, it's not possible. We have a totally gated in private piece of property, and there are cameras watching the only entrance. And you are the only ones that went in or out over that time period. And prior to that, we monitor this property. Nobody else was in there. In 2016, a 25-year-old Wall Street banker named Matt was camping near Mount Rainier in Washington state. His job was so hectic that in the rare times he got a chance to, he would disappear into the wilderness for a few days to clear his head. Despite living in one of the biggest cities in the world, Matt was actually a very competent outdoorsman, and so for this trip, he decided he would stay way off any trail deep in the backcountry in random locations. On the first night, he found a nice clearing in the trees, and so he set up his campsite there. He ate some food over his fire, he pitched his tent, climbed inside, and within a few minutes, he was fast asleep. Several hours later, Matt woke up to some strange sounds coming from outside of his tent. It sounded like a couple of animals or maybe one animal moving around right outside. And so after a while of just hearing this constant sound, he rolled over and he barely unzipped his tent flap just to look out and see if he could see whatever animal it was. And what he saw shocked him. There was a man sitting in front of his fire pit. There was no fire in his fire pit. And the guy was just sitting there with his hands on his knees, looking straight down. And periodically he would just kick his feet in the ashes of the fire pit. And Matt didn't even know what to do. So he's just looking at him through this little tiny gap in his tent. And this man all of a sudden looks up directly at Matt and makes eye contact with him. And the guy's eyes go wide and he stands up, turns around and runs away from Matt's campsite. Matt has no idea how to react to this, and so he just quickly unzips his tent, jumps outside, and shines his light into the forest looking for this guy. He's thinking to himself, who is this guy? I am in the middle of nowhere in the backcountry of Washington state. How long was he sitting outside there for? What does he want? And so as Matt is trying to make sense of this totally weird thing, he's thinking, okay, I'm gonna look out and I'm gonna see his flashlight somewhere, or I'm gonna see his campsite. You know, maybe he's set up nearby, and he's looking around into the total darkness. He's looking through all the trees, any light source anywhere out there he would see. And there's not one. There's no fire, there's no flashlight. There is nothing. And so eventually Matt goes back inside of his tent, he zips it up, and he's just left kind of dumbfounded. He can't understand how some person was just sitting outside of his tent for no apparent reason and then vanished into the forest without even turning on a flashlight. And so after a very restless night, finally the sun came up again and Matt was very relieved. He stepped outside, and after a little bit of time now from this strange incident, Matt started to tell himself that all that was is some guy happened to set up his campsite nearby. It is possible, albeit rare because we're in the backcountry, and maybe he was just intoxicated and he wandered over here, and you know, stranger things have happened, so that's probably all it was. And so Matt felt like there was nothing to worry about. He packed up his campsite and he began hiking into the forest. Matt didn't have a planned route. Instead, he had a map and a compass, and he began just kind of wandering in the forest, kind of exploring wherever he wanted to go. And over the next 2 days, he covered at least 10, maybe 15 miles in kind of random zigzag directions. He found a nice clearing and he set up another campsite. That night, he set up a fire and he was eating some food near his fire. And then as he's sitting there, he hears rustling coming from behind him. And he's pretty sure it's an animal, so he turns around and he doesn't see anything. And he goes back to eating his food. And then a little while later, he hears some more rustling behind him. And this time, he can't really just write it off. Clearly, there is something behind him that's moving around. And so he stood up, turned around, and remained motionless and just listened, expecting to see maybe a deer come out of the woods. But instead, he hears a man's voice come out of the darkness that says,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
And Matt's heart starts racing. He knows that even though he can't see him, it has to be the same guy he saw 2 days ago, because they are in the middle of nowhere. He hasn't seen any other hikers or campers or anyone, and clearly this guy has the ability to sneak up on him. And so he's thinking, what does this guy want? I just spent the past 2 days hiking in random directions for 15 miles, and he must have followed me. And so Matt, not knowing what else to do, just says, I don't know where Bell's Canyon is. And then there's silence. And Matt, one part of him is thinking, I hope this guy does not come into the light. I hope he just goes away. The other part of him is thinking, well, you know, maybe this is a different person that is lost and they're looking for this place called Bell's Canyon, and they'll come into the light. It'll be a big relief. I'll send them on their merry way and everything will be fine. But as Matt is having this wishful thinking, the voice from the shadows does not come any closer, but instead asks the same question a bit more forcefully this time.
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
This time, Matt did not not respond. Now he was scared. This is not some friendly hiker looking for directions. There's something wrong. And so Matt, knowing he's all alone out here, he knew he had to do something to try to take control of this situation. And so he took a deep breath, he reached down and grabbed his flashlight, and in one swift motion, he lifted his light up and shined it in the direction of this guy's voice. And what he saw was this guy from 2 days ago looking out from behind a tree right in Matt's direction. He was hiding from him. And when the light hit him, the man barked at Matt to aim it away. And Matt kind of instinctively lowered his light, but now he was too scared to raise it again, and now he knows it's the same guy. This guy has been following me for 2 days. And so for several minutes, Matt just stood there absolutely terrified, and this guy, he just stayed out there. Matt didn't hear him move. It was just a complete standstill. And then the silence was broken yet again by this voice, except somehow he had moved even closer to Matt. And when he came through asking the same question,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
his voice was so close to Matt that Matt got scared and raised his light up, and the man was standing just a few feet away from him. And this time, the man's eyes got wide like they did the first time they saw Matt, and he turned around and he ran into the forest again. Matt, not knowing any better, just began running after him, but he only ran for about 30 seconds before he realized the terrain out here is so rough. He's gonna fall, get hurt, he's gonna get lost, and this guy's already long gone. He somehow managed to run immediately so far away, and so Matt just goes back to his campsite, and he's thinking to himself, what do I do? I have no cell phone service. I'm at least 3 days away from my car, and I'm in the middle of nowhere. No one even knows where I am because I didn't chart a course. I didn't tell anyone where I was gonna be. And so Matt just grabbed his knife and stood in the middle of the campsite, and for hours and hours, he just kept looking around, expecting this guy to just show up again or start speaking to him from somewhere out in the darkness. It was absolutely horrifying. Finally, by about 3 in the morning, Matt was so tired that he had to go to sleep. He hadn't heard this guy again, he didn't see him again, and he figured, I need a little bit of sleep because tomorrow he's gonna pack up his campsite and begin this epic journey back to his car. And so he climbed in his tent and he had a very restless next couple of hours. And then the sun came up, Matt jumped out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and began practically running in the direction of his car. All day as he was hiking, Matt kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see this guy, because clearly he had followed him for multiple days, over 15 miles, and so the likelihood that he's still following him was really high. And so all day, Matt just felt like he was being watched, he was totally terrified, and then the sun started to go down, and Matt knew he would have to camp out again. And so he found a clearing in the trees, he set up his campsite, and he was so tired from running basically all day and being so mentally exhausted from this experience that he just got in his tent and fell asleep very quickly. But several hours later, he woke up to the sound of somebody walking around his tent, and he knew it had to be this guy. He's still in the middle of nowhere. He's not even close to the parking lot yet. And so this guy is still following him. And so Matt sat up in his tent, he clutched his knife, and for hours and hours and hours, all night, this guy just walked around his campsite. And then around 4 or 5 in the morning, he scampered off. When the sun finally came up, Matt leapt out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and literally just began running in the direction of his car, hoping that maybe he could get there before needing to camp out one more night. And so all day as he moved, he's looking over his shoulder, knowing this guy is following him. At this point, it's not even a question. He's somewhere in the forest, but he could never see him. And unfortunately, as the sun was setting, he knew he was not going to be able to make it to his car. He was just too far away. And so at some point, when it got too dark to keep moving, he had to find a clearing and set up his tent again. And so Matt climbed inside of his tent, he zipped it up behind him, he grabbed his knife, and he sat there, expecting to hear this guy come walking around. But after several hours, he didn't hear him. And Matt started to wonder, maybe this guy has left me alone, finally. Maybe he's not following me anymore. And so Matt, who was totally exhausted, laid down to go to sleep. And then as he's laying there from somewhere out in the woods,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
Matt immediately sat up. His heart began racing so fast that he actually was concerned he might have a heart attack. And he didn't know what to do, he didn't know what to say, so he just sat there holding his knife. And then this guy began running past his campsite, making animal sounds, and he would stop periodically and moan and grunt, and he'd kick up leaves, and then he'd run past his campsite again, over and over and over again, until the sun finally came up and this guy scampered off back into the woods. Matt didn't waste any time. He leapt out of his tent, packed his stuff up, and ran all the way back to his car. When he finally got inside of his car, shut the door, and locked it, he cried tears of joy. He was so unbelievably relieved. And he peeled out of the parking lot. He got to a nearby hotel. He finally got cell phone reception, and he considered calling the police about this guy, but he thought, what am I going to tell them? He didn't commit a crime. He was just terrifying. And so he decided not to call the police. He finally flew back to New York, and he just had to accept that there was some strange guy out in the wilderness of Washington state who was able to hunt him over 3 days and 30 miles in rugged terrain without the use of a flashlight, without any gear, and all he ever said to Matt was,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
Wait, don't go anywhere. We actually have a bonus story for you. This final story has quickly become one of the classics on this channel. It's a story about a forest in Connecticut that is actually illegal to enter, basically because of maybe paranormal activity out there, we don't know, but it is actually illegal to go into this forest. There's a whole crazy story around it. I actually told the story on a live stream recently about Dudleytown, and so we went ahead and took that footage, we edited it, made it really pretty, and now you get to watch it in case you didn't see it live. Enjoy. In the summer of 1906, there was this couple, Dr. William Clark and his wife Harriet, and they were up in northwestern Connecticut, and they're driving along this winding country road in a place called Litchfield County. And as they're driving along, it's so scenic and beautiful with rolling hills and green everywhere. And what they were doing is they were looking for a location in this area that could serve as a location for their second home. So Dr. Clark was an oncologist, and they lived back in New York City, where he and his wife lived kind of a fabulous life. He was super successful. He was not only an oncologist, he was a big-time professor as well. And so they lived this amazing life in New York. But, their lives were really hectic. New York City is a hectic place. Add in the fact that they were very social people, always going out and going to functions and this and that. And so they had some extra money, and they wanted to, buy or build a second home that would kind of serve as their retreat away from the city. And after, looking all around the country, they found Litchfield County was kind of like the opposite of New York City. Very few people were living there at the time. And again, it's this beautiful scenic place. And so it just seemed kind of like the perfect spot. So again, Dr. Clark and Harriet, they're just driving along, beautiful day. And they eventually, in Litchfield County, they eventually reach this beautiful red wood-covered bridge. And they go over it, and when they get to the other side, their field of view opened up because there weren't as many trees right on the other side of this bridge. And they suddenly had this view up and to the right, maybe, half a mile away or something, of this weirdly shaded forest. Now, you got to remember that basically everywhere they're looking, there's trees everywhere. It's very densely forested everywhere, but there was just this one kind of rise, like a pretty big hill, a prominent hill, that was really dark, like totally shaded. And it was because there's two mountains or two hills on either side of it, almost creating like a valley. And so it just looked like, wow, that's a very shaded forest. And as you'll see, it's actually called the Dark Entry Forest, in part because of how shaded it is. And so they've just come out of this bridge, and they're seeing this area up on this hill. There's no buildings, nothing. It's just trees. And there was just something immediately about it that really stood out to Dr. Clark and his wife. And they noticed that the road they were on, there appeared to be like an access road that kind of splintered off the road they were on that appeared to go up into that forest, the Dark Entry Forest. And so they look at each other and they're like, hey, let's go up there. Maybe that's the place where we can find our spot for our second home. And so Dr. Clark pulls off the main road, goes on the access road, and he begins making his way up towards this kind of darkened forest area. And really quickly, the road itself was very overgrown. At first it seemed like it was relatively well maintained, but the farther up they went towards this dark forest, the rougher it got, to the point where Dr. Clark couldn't even drive on it. There was too many potholes and everything. So they end up pulling the car over and parking. And at this point, they're actually in a bit of a clearing, and they can actually see up ahead of them where they parked. It looks almost like an entry point to the forest. The tree line is right in front of them, and there's kind of like a gap in the trees where this rugged road kind of continues into the forest, and they continue walking on foot towards the entry of this forest. Again, it's beautiful, scenic, very sunny, beautiful day. They're super excited, and they walk into the shade of the forest. And right away, it's like all the sunlight basically vanishes, but not in a spooky way, kind of like they lowered the brightness slightly, and it's very quiet. And the canopy in Dark Entry Forest is known for being really, really thick, and so not much light was pushing through, but it created almost like it was like they were walking into a bubble. It's just pure, unadulterated silence and peace. And as they're walking on this road, which quickly becomes mostly like a little path, it doesn't even look like a road at some point. It's just kind of like grass that's been pushed down. Clearly, not many people or anything is coming into this forest, at least not from this direction. And as they're walking along, they're looking around and they're like, this place is so beautiful. I mean, it was already beautiful, but this is especially beautiful. Like, they walked maybe a couple hundred feet into the forest, and off to their right is this apple orchard, untouched. No one's taking these apples. It's just like a wild apple orchard, and there's deer that are just eating the apples off the tree, and they're looking over at Dr. Clark and his wife, and they're completely unafraid. They don't see people, so this is not terrifying for them. Deer just eating their apples, and then on the other side of the road, there's these huge fields full of flowers that are, again, trees are everywhere, but there's all these flowers at the bases of the trees, lilies and roses and yellow bitter tansies, or I think that's what they're called. So all these beautiful flowers. And then at some point, as they walked a little bit farther into this Dark Entry Forest, the sunlight that was poking through, it was hitting the ground in such a way that it was actually sparkling, because this forest was actually on a hillside, and there was this mineral called mica. If you're familiar, it's like this little translucent, it almost looks like kind of clouded glass. That's actually a mineral that comes from the ground. And when the sunlight hits it, it kind of looks like it sparkles. And so they're looking around at these wild animals that are unafraid of them, and flowers, and there's, babbling brooks and streams. I mean, it's like out of a Disney movie. This is like a perfect place. And so by the time the couple came out of Dark Entry Forest, this is only, like they walked around for maybe an hour or so. By the time they were coming out, they were completely sold that was going to be where they went ahead and bought their land to build a second home. And so they go back to New York City, and they put in the paperwork to buy the land, and they buy 1,000 acres in this forest, which it's ridiculous to imagine just casually buying 1,000 acres anywhere. But they did. They bought their 1,000 acres. And as soon as they had it, as soon as it was finalized, Dr. Clark began calling around to all these builders, local builders in Connecticut, that could help him build his home. And he had no intention of building some humongous home. They bought a huge amount of land, but they only wanted to build a small cabin. But despite the job being relatively simple, and despite Dr. Clark offering quite a bit of money to anybody who was willing to go out there and build this for him, none of the builders would do it. They never really gave a straight answer to Dr. Clark about why they would not go into Dark Entry Forest, but universally, no one would do it. And so, Dr. Clark, he definitely was discouraged by that, but he just kind of chalked it up to, okay, so obviously it's kind of an isolated place. It's relatively hard to get into Dark Entry Forest, and where they had bought this land, it was pretty far into the forest. And so he just decided, okay, it just might not be worth it for them. It's logistically kind of a nightmare. They don't want to do it. And so Dr. Clark is undeterred, and he decides he will just build the house himself. Dr. Clark, he grew up on a farm in New Jersey. He was a very handy guy. He had built buildings before, so this was something he could do. And so over the next several months, every weekend, Dr. Clark would make his way on his own to Dark Entry Forest, and it also was full of owls that were hooting all the time. So there's like this audio side of being in this forest, which is really intense. Like there's owls hooting constantly. And actually, Dr. Clark and Harriet thought it was really cute that these owls, it seemed like they were almost personally greeting them as they came into the forest. And so Dr. Clark, every weekend for several months, he would go into Dark Entry Forest and be greeted by the owls, and he would go to the land where the 1,000-acre land. And actually, he had identified this one kind of flat spot in the 1,000 acres that was good for building a home. And so the first thing he did over these several weekends he was out there is he just cut down this massive swath of hemlock trees, just kind of clearing out that flat area. And then he chopped up the trees he cut down into lumber, and he used that to build a rustic, simple 2-story cabin. And then after this cabin was built, kind of up on this hill, there happened to be another hill not too far away from the cabin where there was a freshwater spring right at the top. And so, Dr. Clark, he went up and laid piping from the freshwater spring down to his cabin. So they had fresh water in the cabin. And then down the hill from where the cabin was constructed was a small brook. And Dr. Clark, he found himself always going down and just staring into this beautiful brook because there were all these trout, because nobody fished out here. This is like an abandoned place, basically. There's all these trout just swimming around unencumbered, just leaping out of the water. If they even do that, I don't know if trout do that. I think they do. And so he ended up actually building a swimming pool right next to the brook, specifically so he could sit in the swimming pool and watch the trout. And so by Thanksgiving of that year, so 1906, by Thanksgiving, the property was done. The cabin had been built, everything was done. And so that holiday season, Dr. Clark and Harriet and their whole family would come out and they would spend the holidays, sitting in their pool, watching the trout and just having a wonderful time. And really for many years, every summer and every major holiday, the Clark family would come out to their beautiful dark entry cabin and they would stay there. And it was really perfect. That is until 1918. In 1918, in the summer, Dr. Clark and Harriet were at their cabin and they were having a nice time when Dr. Clark got word that he was actually being called back to New York City for an emergency. Remember, he's an oncologist, so these things happen and he was called back. And for whatever reason, Harriet, who normally likely would have joined him and just gone back to New York with him, she decided to stay. I mean, they've been coming here for years by this point, so she probably felt somewhat comfortable, although admittedly she was very unhappy about this. She didn't want to be there alone, but again, she decides to stay. But she tells Dr. Clark, because she didn't know how long he would actually be in New York, and he didn't really know either. But she said, you got to promise me you'll be back here as soon as you possibly can. And Dr. Clark would tell her that, I'll do my best. I should be back here in maybe, a couple of days from now. And I promise you I will come home as soon as I possibly can. And so Dr. Clark packs up his things and he and his wife, they leave their cabin. They, walk their way down the trail, listening to the owls and looking at the mica sparkling on the ground. And they leave the forest and they make their way to a nearby train station, which actually was not that far away from the entry to the forest. And Harriet dropped off her husband and she watched, as he, boarded and it began taking off and he disappeared to go to New York. And Dr. Clark, as he's vanishing, traveling on this train, he's thinking to himself that, okay, I'll be in New York just for a couple of days. I'll be home. I'll be back in no time. Little did he know, over the course of time he was going to be in New York, his wife would endure something that is just truly horrifying. So, before I explain to you what happened after Dr. Clark left, you need to understand some history about this forest. History that Dr. Clark and Harriet did not look into before deciding to purchase these 1,000 acres. Because had they done the research into this area, they likely would not have bought the land. So there actually used to be a town that was settled in the Dark Entry Forest. It was called Dudleytown. And it was settled in the 1740s. And at first it was just a couple of families just getting by, but pretty quickly it grew to about 30 families and several structures and houses and the whole nine yards. Like, it's a small community inside of this beautiful forest, and things were great. For a small town in the 1700s, things were stable. But starting at the end of the 1700s, like in the 1790s up till about the 1800s, things started to go really, really badly in Dudleytown. And in fact, because of how badly it went, it earned this, the conclusion was that Dudleytown had to be cursed. And that lore had stuck around, which is actually why those builders refused to do the work for Dr. Clark, because they believed it was a cursed place. So this is what led to it being believed to be cursed. And I'll tell you, it's pretty creepy. So it started with the Carter family. So the Carter family was a big family inside of Dudleytown, and it was in 1790, 1792, there was this cholera epidemic that broke out in this small town, and 6 members of the Carter family died really suddenly from cholera. And the remaining members of the Carter family, which was significant, I think there was a dozen people still left, might have been a few less than that, but a pretty good chunk of people, they were so grief-stricken from the loss that they decided to just literally abandon their houses in Dudleytown and go back to New York City, where they happened to be from as well, same as Dr. Clark. But as soon as they got to New York,
they were massacred by natives that lived in the area. And the only people that survived this massacre were 3 children, and the 3 children were kidnapped and never seen again. And so that was the start of bad things happening to people in Dudleytown. The next thing that happened is there was a guy named Hollister. We don't know his last name, but he either fell off a roof or he was pushed. We don't really know, but either way, he died. But he died on or near another person's home whose name was Tanner. Okay, so Hollister dies, and he dies on or near Tanner's home. And after Hollister died, which again, it was shrouded in mystery, Tanner, the owner of the home where this guy died, he began talking obsessively, and it's documented, obsessively about strange creatures lurking around the tree line inside of Dark Entry Forest, right around Dudleytown, every night. That's all he saw. So guy dies, and all of a sudden, Tanner is noticing all these strange creatures. And he's telling everybody in town that there's something going on here. Nobody believed him. And so slowly, Tanner, every night, he would see whatever he was seeing, and it drove him insane, completely insane, to the point where he couldn't even function, and his daughter had to take care of him until he passed away. And as Tanner was losing his mind, his next door neighbor, whose name was Abel, began to talk as well about these creatures that were coming to the edge of the tree line surrounding Dudleytown most nights. And just like Tanner, Abel as well slowly lost his mind over these creatures because nobody believed him. And then all the way up until like just past the 1800s, so many people just randomly died in Dudleytown, some from disease for sure, but others, they'd just be found dead. And then many people as well began citing these strange creatures that were lurking all around. By 1900, the only family that was still alive in Dudleytown was this family called the Brophies. And it was a fairly big family. And the mother, she suddenly died of cholera. The 2 sons, they were accused of theft in another town and then fled and vanished. And so literally it's down to John Brophy, the actual last person who's living in Dudleytown. And one night, he didn't know why, but his cabin burned to the ground. And after his cabin, or while his cabin was burning, people were called out. They saw the smoke. They came out to put out this fire. And the last anyone saw of John, who's lost his whole family, he's lost everything, is he just turned and walked deeper into the forest and was never seen again. And no one could find him. That was it. And that was the last person who lived in Dudleytown. And that marked the moment that Dudleytown went from, still being occupied to being a literal ghost town. And you can actually look up the newspaper article that documented the moment when Dudleytown became a ghost town. No one lives there. A few years later is when Dr. Clark and Harriet were taking their stroll through Litchfield County and up into Dark Entry Forest and saying, wow, this is the place for us. And they saw the ruins of Dudleytown. They walked past the crumbling foundations of these old homes, and there was all these remnants of this town that was still there, but much the way they viewed the owls as being kind of charming, they also viewed this rundown old town that was gone as kind of cute, and it made them want to stay there more. So they were aware of the town, but didn't do the research. Apparently Dudleytown was cursed, and that is where they bought their land. So, fast forward to 1918. So Dr. Clark, he's left for this emergency trip to New York, and it would turn out he was only needed in New York for 36 hours. It was, as short as he could have expected it to be. So less than 2 days later, keeping his word to his wife, he's back on a train, and he's heading back to that stop where Harriet had dropped him off near the Dark Entry Forest. And although this was rare that, Dr. Clark would leave his wife in the cabin, he expected her to be waiting for him at the train station. They didn't have an exact time that he was going to be there because it was not entirely planned, but he had said, I'll be here in like 1 or 2 days max. And so he just kind of expected his wife to check the schedule and be at the train platform. But as he's pulling into the station, he sees his wife is not there. Now, this was not some huge cause for concern, but it was enough of a red flag that as, he's pulling into the station, Dr. Clark is thinking something feels off. And so he ends up going from the train station, and he actually walked the rest of the way. He didn't take a car or anything. He walked to that access road and made his way up to the entry of Dark Entry Forest. And as soon as he walked into the forest, so daylight out here, he steps into the canopy and it's dark again. And remember, it used to feel so welcoming and wonderful going into that forest. It was so peaceful, but now it has a different feel. He steps into the forest and suddenly it feels threatening. It feels ominous. And the owls that are hooting the whole time he steps in, it didn't feel like they were greeting him. It felt like they were telling him to leave. But he had to find his wife, and he's thinking she's up at the cabin. That's where we need to go. And so he begins kind of jogging, fast walking. He's getting a little nervous through the forest. And as he's moving through, the sounds of these owls are getting louder and louder and louder and more threatening, until finally, when he gets to the clearing, when he can actually look up and see where he built his cabin up on this hill, it's like a cacophony of noise. It's just constant hooting, almost like it doesn't even sound like hooting. It's just a loud sound that's constant. And so Dr. Clark is starting to panic, but he gets even more panicked when he looks up at the cabin. He doesn't see his wife, but he sees the front door to this cabin is slightly ajar. And so Dr. Clark, he runs the rest of the way up the hill, owls hooting the whole time. He gets to the door, and he's terrified. He knows there's something wrong here, but he gets the courage. He opens up the front door, and the second he steps into this home, which he has loved and spent years and years in with his family, he steps in and everything is different. Instead of it being peaceful, he now feels this almost high-pitched sound, like inside of his head for a second, and he's confused. And then he hears what sounds like maniacal laughter coming from the second floor. He doesn't see anybody on the first floor. He thinks it's his wife, and so he charges upstairs. He gets to the landing, and he sees the door to his bedroom, where he would expect his wife to be, is slightly open, and he can hear this laughter coming from inside of this room, this maniacal, crazy, loud, high-pitched laughter. And he's totally panicked. He goes to the door, and he opens it up, and there, in the back corner of the bedroom, is his wife. And she's in the fetal position, and her mouth has been opened as wide as it can go. And the laughter that he's hearing is coming out of her body, but her jaw isn't moving. Her chest is heaving, and this maniacal laughter is just coming out of her as she stares him dead in the eyes. And so Dr. Clark, he was so terrified at what he was seeing and all the hooting and all this craziness going on that he just turned and ran away. We don't know what happened to Harriet Clark over those 36 hours that her husband was gone, but something happened to her. And when she was taken away from this cabin, the only thing she would say is, the strange creatures kept coming back. I kept seeing strange creatures. The same thing that all the people in Dudleytown had said that caused them to flee the town. And so we don't know exactly what became of Harriet. There is one account that says she was forever, she went to a mental hospital and stayed there until she passed. Another account says she went back to New York with Dr. Clark, where she took her life. But either way, the final thing was she claimed to have seen the strange creatures and lost her mind as well. Following the story, Dark Country Forest really took on this unbelievable legend. I mean, people knew about this story. They knew about the legend of the 1700s and 1800s, but this felt recent. I mean, this was a documented case of this doctor's wife. And so it spawned a lot of people going into Dark Country Forest to see what's out there. And lots of people who go into that forest before it became illegal reported feeling phantom hands slapping them on the back and feeling really intense pockets of cold air. And actually, the very famous paranormal couple, Ed and Lorraine Warren, in the 1970s, they went out and ran this special series about what happened in the Dark Country Forest. And they came out and said, absolutely, that forest is demonically possessed. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's
collection of strange, dark, and mysterious stories, and you're looking for more content like that, remember, we have a whole slew of podcasts under the Ballen Studios umbrella. All these podcasts are amazing, it's all bingeable content, and it's available right now for free. All you have to do is go to any podcast